we give to you Cardinal Brislin, finding God through restless hearts, visible hope of the kingdom of God. Give him a hand.
Canon Desmond, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be with you this morning. But thank you particularly for the prayer and worship and the opening prayer as we gather together for this winter school, with our focus very much on God and God's involvement in the world. As you heard, I will talk of restlessness and finding God in restlessness. I will refer to the scriptures quite briefly. That may seem a little contradictory in this regard. And then I'll talk about St. Augustine and how he discovered God through his restlessness, discovered God within himself, and how this transformed his life. And we ask ourselves, is it possible for us also to achieve this when in the modern world relativism prevails and truth is seen as subjective? I will then look at the importance of embracing restlessness rather than denying it, and how this can help us to move from a spirituality merely of interiority to the practical expression of being fellow workers with Christ, not only in praying, thy kingdom come, but also in advancing the establishment of God's kingdom. Restlessness is part of human experience, and it is generally not a very pleasant or desirable experience. I chose to talk on this topic firstly because my thoughts turned to restlessness after reading an address by Pope Francis to young people. Among other things, he turned to them and said to them, "Do you dream? Do you have restlessness in your thoughts, in your hearts? Are you restless or are you retired? Retired young people already. Do not forget restless dreaming," he said to them. He went on to encourage them to take risks and never to lose their sense of amazement and wonderment. All this was said to counteract what he termed short thought, a superficial way of thinking only about the here and now, with no reference to the past or to the future. Such thinking leads to a distortion of reality. But secondly, I chose the topic because we live in a world that appears to be increasingly restless. External to the self, the world is changing rapidly, and foundations that once seemed like rock are more now like sea sand. People are on the move throughout the world, and there seems to be little that can be done to halt the migrations of people. Truths that were taken for granted are questioned or even denied. The anthropology of the human person is not only being questioned, but it is even being destroyed. Relationships and alliances between nations that seem solid have become fluid. People are connected with each other globally to an extent never experienced before, and yet the connections are cyber and not relational. Furthermore, with many young people, there seems to be a greater restlessness within themselves, expressed as discontent, a longing for something more in life, a longing for something new. There seems to be a renewed search for meaning and for purpose. Restlessness, as I've said, has been part of humans' experience throughout history. What makes today's restlessness different is that there seems to be a vacuum of meaning, despite many, many contesting theories, opinions, and possibilities that have never occurred before. Furthermore, meaning and truth have become relativized. In the natural pursuit of happiness, for many, happiness has become chasing the wind and being blown this way and that. And so discontentment remains or deepens. In a globalized world, restlessness itself has become globalized. Despite this seeming very negative, there are positive signs of visible hope. You know, the phrase visible hope seems contradictory in itself. St. Paul makes the point in his letter to the Romans, and not only creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes in what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. End of quote. But similarly, in Hebrews we hear, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Yet I believe that there is visible hope of God's kingdom. But before dealing with that, let's just look a little bit more at restlessness. Restlessness, that sense of unease, of disquiet and discontentment, is a nagging feeling that there is something missing and there's a longing for something more, a time of searching. It is a time of inner turbulence to a greater or lesser extent that disturbs our sense of calm and peace. It makes us feel unhappy and unfulfilled. And there are many causes of restlessness. As I've already said, it is firstly a constitutive element of what it means to be human. But it also arises through doubts and problems, relationship difficulties, injustices, isolation, life choices, and many other things. Spiritual restlessness may or may not include a lack of faith, doubting God, a time of dryness, feelings of abandonment by God, a time of questioning and searching. The restlessness that is the focus of this talk refers to those feelings of emptiness and the searching that takes place for something more, the questioning of where and how are we to find happiness. Furthermore, I must say from the outset, I believe that a spirituality of restlessness is needed and that we should not avoid it. So before speaking of some practical outcomes of spirituality or restlessness, it needs to be explored a little bit more. The New Testament calls us to rest and to find peace in Jesus Christ. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest, says Jesus. Again, he says, peace I leave you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. From these and a number of other texts, it is clear that we are called to find peace and rest in God. Yet there are other biblical texts that suggest that it is not only in what is peaceful and serene that leads us to God. For example, after the feeding of the multitudes, we hear Jesus walking on the water. This is what we hear in the Gospel of St. John. When evening came, he was alone. But the boat by this time was many furlongs distant from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. They were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." But immediately he spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Have no fear." And when he got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The richness of the account of Jesus walking on the stormy seas includes the fact that not only did Jesus still the wind and the waves, but he was to be found in the storm and not merely in spite of the storm. The point is that while we are invited and promised stillness, tranquility, and peacefulness, this does not exclude the fact that Christ is also to be found in disquiet and upheaval. Similarly, In alerting his followers to the future suffering they will endure, Jesus told them, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it." We recognize that turmoil, confusion, and suffering do not indicate the absence of God. Perhaps it is best summed up in the simple phrase uttered by Jesus shortly before his passion, which reflects his own inner anguish. "Now my soul is troubled. What shall I say?" These words of Jesus, recorded in the Gospel of St. John, indicate his own inner turmoil. "My soul is troubled. What shall I say?" St. Augustine, of course, famously wrote of his restlessness, which led to his conversion. And I think we're all familiar with his famous words, but I would like to quote them again, because this is pure poetry of St. Augustine's relationship with God. This is what he said: "Where did I find you in order to make your acquaintance in the first place? You could not have been in my memory before I learned to know you. Where then could I have found you in order to learn of you, if not in yourself, far above me? Place here has no meaning. Further away from you or toward you we may travel, but place there is none. O truth, you hold sovereign sway over all who turn to you for counsel, and to all of them you respond at the same time, however diverse their pleas. Clear is your response, but not all hear it clearly. They all appeal to you about what they want, but do not always hear what they want to hear. Your best servant is the one who is less intent on hearing from you what accords with his own will, and more on embracing with his will what he has heard from you. Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you. Lo, you were within, but I outside, seeking there for you. And upon the shapely things you have made, I rushed headlong, I misshapen. You were with me, but I was not with you. They held me back far from you, those things which would have no being were they not in you. You called, shouted, broke through my deafness. You flared, blazed, banished my blindness. You lavished your fragrance. I gasped, and now I pant for you. I tasted you, and now I hunger and thirst. You touched me, and I burnt for your peace. Those words of St. Augustine make it clear, and indeed from our own understanding as Christians, that peace and rest are to be found in God. The scriptures affirm this. For example, we hear in the Psalms, "O God, you are my God. I seek you. My soul thirsts for you, as in a dry, weary land where there is no water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because your merciful love is better than life, my lips will praise you." The words of Psalm 63. St. Augustine spent much of his life searching for truth and meaning. He embraced different philosophies, lived what could be easily called a hedonistic lifestyle, and, as he says, sought truth in the shapely things that God had made, in the material world, that in fact kept him away from God, he says. Yet he did find truth. He found God, not in the shapely things. and not in the external, but he found God within himself. Truth, that is to say God, called to him, shouted at him, and eventually broke through his deafness, which transformed his life into a passionate love for God. And passion is the correct word to use as he expresses his desire for God in such beautiful love poetry. I tasted you, and now I hunger and thirst. You touched me, and I burned for your peace. His restless heart found peace in God. Of course, there are many people who would contest that happiness is to be found in God alone, believing that happiness can be found through other means. But furthermore, St. Augustine did not find God in the external, but only when he searched within himself. And the question arises, is it true that truth, that is to say God, is to be found within us, and that through our restlessness we can come to the same experience as St. Augustine? I think the current descent into relativism, particularly in Western culture, is an example of the rejection of St. Augustine's insight. Relativism denies claims to objectivity in different spheres of life and asserts that beliefs or judgments in those spheres are relative to the perspective of the observer or the context in which they are assessed. In such a view, there can be no absolute truth and no enduring truth. Relativism has its root in the philosophies of such people as Descartes, who famously concluded in his first principle, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The only truth that you can be sure of is that you exist. Everything else is uncertain and cannot be proved to exist. As it has developed these philosophies, and in its more extreme forms of philosophy, this has led to a culture of adopting the belief that it is up to the individual to decide on his or her own reality, and that it is only when the individual has created their own reality that happiness for that person can be achieved. The world outside is to be shaped by the individual to suit what he or she believes will bring happiness. The emphasis on the individual's absolute right of choice is an expression of relativism and the belief that this is the path by which a person must travel to create their own reality. This understanding, while in some sense beneficial for the pursuit of inclusivity and acceptance of difference, is problematic, if for no other reason, that if nothing is definitive, then there is no yardstick against which to measure ourselves, and thus, for example, destroys the concept of conscience, the application of the universal knowledge of the good in specific circumstances. If conscience is destroyed, then right and wrong, good and evil, no longer exist. In its extreme, there would be no concept of justice and no concept of limitation to the realities created by individuals, perhaps with the exception that they should not harm other people. In such a culture, it is not surprising that we are tossed back and forth and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the cunning of men, as we hear in the letter to the Ephesians. The distinction between relativism and St. Augustine's experience is crucial, as it has vast implications for our relationships with others. The fundamental difference between Augustine and relativism is that Augustine did not find God in himself, but rather he found God within himself. The emphasis being that God lived within him, and in God he found the beauty so ancient and so new. It was not in his own self that he found that beauty. God, says Augustine, is not to be found in a place where he holds sway over all who seek him. Augustine's passionate experience of God was that of a God who is both transcendent and immanent, and that is to be found by the best servant, who is the one less intent on hearing from God what accords with his own will, and more on embracing with his will what he has heard from God. God, who transcends all that exists, and yet who is immanent and within the reach of human experience and knowledge, is found by those who listen to God and who are prepared to embrace in their own will what they hear, rather than making their own will the yardstick. Philosophies and rapidly changing social circumstances expressed in modern-day relativism cause us to turn within ourselves, as St. Augustine did, but with the purpose to unleash the individual's will in creating a subjective reality, rather than the desire to subject one's own will to that of God. So, what are the practical consequences? First of all, I believe that in the confusion of the modern world and all the ideas and the opinions that people have, we've got to embrace restlessness. Restlessness makes us feel unsettled, discontent, and unhappy. The natural desire is the knee-jerk reaction to avoid it. And if avoidance is not possible, then the reaction is to find some ways to alleviate the painfulness and sense of isolation that often accompany restlessness. Common trends propagate feel-good solutions, such as I have noted above, shaping and creating one's own reality. Furthermore, the consumerist society in which we live promises happiness through the comfort of materialism, seeking happiness in the beautiful things of life. But ultimately, these do not alleviate inner turmoil, more likely making it worse in the long run. Those seeking God will not only seek him in what is seemingly serene and peaceful, but also to seek him in turbulence, turmoil, and inner disquiet. They will see in them ways in which God is shaking them from complacency and routine, shaking them in order to renew themselves and to rediscover his will. The disciples recognized Christ in the storm. It was when the water of the pool at the sheep gate in Bethsaida was troubled that healing took place. It was when his soul was troubled that Jesus accepted fully the will of God. It would be wrong to seek turmoil in our lives, but when it comes, we can face it head on and embrace it as a means of seeking God's will and an assistance to accepting his will in its entirety. And it is necessary. Christianity has a history of more than 2,000 years and is practiced on every continent and in every country in the world. It is adapted to the cultures and customs of many nations and of different eras. During times and places, the gospel has been preached, but there's also been accumulation of practices that were good and appropriate at one time and in one context, but are not essential to the faith and which have lost their meaning. They can become extra baggage and accumulation that we find difficult to let go, and that even though at one time they facilitated the mission of the church, they are now a burden or even an obstruction to the proclamation of the good news. Similarly, in our personal faith journey, we can succumb to routine, to become tired in our faith, letting go of the zeal we once had, and gaining security in legalism while avoiding the gospel imperatives. In other words, we can fall in love with the rules and the regulations we make while neglecting those of the gospel. The Christian community can become self-referential, employing all its efforts to maintain and serve itself rather than to fulfill the mission to go out and preach the gospel. Restlessness is a sign of our times and is the opportunity to rekindle the gift of God that is within us. That there is restlessness in the world is in itself a sign of God's presence and visible hope of the unfolding of his kingdom. It is meant to shake us into reality. And for those who pray, thy kingdom come, there is a need to reflect deeply on our response to the modern world and our fidelity to the gospel. Secondly, in talking of restlessness and its practical implications, we have to move from the internal to the external. However we encounter God, it leads to a transformation of the inner person, but also it must lead to the transformation of our outward expression of lived faith. Both are needed. We must avoid over-spiritualization, and we must also avoid becoming simply do-gooders. Both inner transformation and the inner experience of God and the outward expression of lived faith enrich each other. When we look on what is outside of us, there is much beauty that raises our spirits from the mundane and drudgery of human reality to the appreciation of nature and the promise of a realm beyond our experience. The beauty of nature and art and music inspire us and inspire within us goodness and wonder. They are testimonies of God's presence. It's not difficult to reflect on the glory of God when looking on Table Mountain or at a sunrise, or the stirrings of the sea, or walking through Newland's forest and seeing crystal clear springs. In themselves, they instill in us peace, tranquility, and a sense of what could be and what indeed will be. But just as there's this dynamic between restlessness and peacefulness, it would be a mistake to believe that God is to be recognized only in such beauty, and that we should seek him only in what is considered beautiful. It is not on our appreciation of nature's beauty or the beauty of art that we are going to be judged. We are to be judged in how we have responded to the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, and those in prison. Christ is to be recognized in the squalor of poverty, the odors of disease, the isolation of the rejected and excluded, the brokenness of the human condition, the loneliness of the aged, the powerlessness of the oppressed, and in the faces of all who suffer, especially those who suffer at the hands of their fellow human beings. Just as it is easier and more satisfying to enjoy times of peace rather than restlessness, so it is easier to enjoy the vision of God in what is beautiful, like Table Mountain, rather than in human suffering. But we need both. To me, one of the most remarkable characters we meet in the scriptures, it is a person who amazes me and fascinates me. He's not named. He's spoken of only briefly, and we know nothing of his life apart from one brief episode. I'm talking about the repentant thief, the one crucified with Christ, and who looked on Jesus, who was in agony and in the throes of death. Jesus bleeding, vulnerable, and absolutely powerless. And he saw in Jesus, the dying Jesus, the Redeemer, the source of salvation. He may have heard of Jesus before, perhaps he even witnessed some of Jesus' miracles, but how could he recognize at that point of total abandonment and desolation, a time when even Jesus' closest associates had deserted him, how could he recognize that it is through Jesus that he could be saved? We all need to become like the repentant thief and to see Christ in every person, but most especially in those who suffer the most. Hope becomes visible and is visible when people respond to the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, and those in prison. Because in doing these things, we could say that they become a sacrament of the compassion of God. Compassion towards the suffering is juxtaposed to any philosophy that seeks to put the self at the center for the pursuit of happiness. When self remains at the focus, it can only lead to a sense of deprivation and dissatisfaction, of how much one does not have rather than of how much one has. The encounter with love, that is to say, the encounter with God, is meant to take us from the focus on self to the focus on the needs of others, not only in terms of alleviation of their suffering and the solace we can give them, but also to pursue the root causes of their affliction when it has come through the hands of other human beings. In short, the pursuit of the integrity of human dignity is integral to Christian living and to the proclamation of the gospel. The kingdom of God is in our midst. When God made the world, he saw that everything he made was good. It has been distorted through pride, disobedience, and sin. Christ came to restore creation to its original purpose and glory. We are fellow workers with Christ. The pursuit of justice is the endeavor to restore humankind to the dignity with which it was created. For man was created in the image of God. Justice is the restoration of that dignity and pays respect to the image of God in man, and that our bodies have been made into the temple of the Holy Spirit. Yet we should not forget that justice in itself is insufficient for the restoration of creation and the coming of kingdom. The aim of justice is to restore equality and dignity, which demands restitution and reconciliation. We have been given the ministry of reconciliation as ambassadors of Christ, to lead people to reconcile with God and to each other. At an even deeper level is the virtue of mercy, for Christian justice must always be tempered by mercy. We should never forget that when it comes to God's judgment, in justice we are condemned, but in mercy we are redeemed. And there can be no reconciliation without mercy and generous forgiveness. These are the fundamental pillars of peace and the restoration of harmony in creation, harmony between men, between man and creation, and between man and God. So let's look at this. The third point, we are fellow workers with Christ in serving his kingdom. The rapid change in the world and its accompanying restlessness in the context in which we have been chosen to strive for the establishment of God's kingdom, knowing that the kingdom of God will never be brought about in its finality in this world, yet nonetheless it is present in the world and is unfolding. We strive and hope for the new Jerusalem and for the new heavens and earth, where every tear will be wiped away and the glory of God will reign for eternity. As in every age, the gospel is preached in the context of prevailing culture. The message does not change, nor do the virtues and the values of the kingdom change. To effectively proclaim the kingdom, we have to pay attention to prevailing culture. Empires of the past ensured that their cultures became dominant of those they conquered. The modern world is somewhat different, since we have become a connected and globalized world. The dominance of Western culture has been disseminated to most of the world, with the value it places on individualism, freedom of choice, and materialism. There is much good in Western culture, but there are also the negative consequences that can potentially destroy the very meaning of what it means to be human. I believe that in continuing the work of evangelization and proclaiming God's kingdom, there are 5 important features of how this should be done, taking into account the prevailing culture and being fellow workers with Christ. Firstly, about community. The human person is relational in his or her very being. The movement of masses of people to the cities has led to a certain anonymity of life. People live with thousands of others around them, and yet they are often lonely and isolated. People are connected through social media, but have no relationship with each other. So typified when you see a family at a meal with all of them looking at their cell phones. Traditional structures of support have broken down, as well as cultural structures of formation of children and young people. In the conglomerate of peoples living in cities, there is a trust deficit, with the consequence that meaningful relationships become difficult. Community is a human need. Thus, throughout the history of salvation, God has formed a people to live in covenant with him. Faith communities need to take special care today to ensure that they really are communities with a deep sense of belonging together, knowing each other, and caring for each other, ensuring that our communities do not themselves become places of anonymity. This may also demand a change in our own attitudes and understanding of what the faith communities is and what it is meant to be, whether it is meant to be a community only of those who are perfect, or whether it can accept brokenness and human failure. Often faith communities act on the principles behave, believe, then you can belong. Should a community rather not be based on the principle you belong, now believe and behave? Living as community gives witness to human dignity and its relational imperative. The second thing, accompaniment. Associated with the response to brokenness and human failure, and considering the widespread breakdown of stable family life, as well as the diminishment of initiation rights for the young, there is a need to give accompaniment to those who are struggling, those who fall foul of the values of the kingdom of God, especially among young people. Patient guidance and understanding, rather than judgment and condemnation, are necessary ingredients to assist people as they navigate the confusion and the cacophony of voices and opinions. It is about walking together with those who are seeking and yet are not yet finding their way of life. Mentorship, sponsorship, similar words. Thirdly, listening. The Spirit of God is at work throughout the world. It is arduous to know and find the truth among so many conflicting voices. There can be a temptation with our long history of Christianity to know all the answers. And often when we do give answers, we do not really know the questions that people are asking. The Spirit blows where he wills, and it is beyond our control when, where, and through whom the Spirit will choose to speak. Not only do we listen to the Spirit through the scriptures and in prayer, using means such as Lectio Divina, attentive listening to others, as well as reading the signs of the times, are important to coming to know God's will for the modern world and the response that we are to give for the growth of his kingdom. In a chattering world, the temptation is always to speak, to argue, to contradict. Listening in quietness and discerning are necessary, just as Elijah recognized the presence of God in the gentle breeze. Fourthly, dialogue. Dialogue is the art of both listening and expressing one's own ideas, thoughts, and beliefs. Dialogue can be a difficult and painful process. A few years ago, Rod Dreher wrote a book entitled The Benedict Option. The book has many positive and constructive suggestions. However, it does seem to suggest a withdrawal of Christianity into a type of monastic enclosure, not in a physical sense, in the sense of like-minded Christians coming together to embrace exile from the prevailing post-Christian culture and to promote a counterculture. While the ideas of mutual support and accompaniment are positive, withdrawal from society and from engagement with the prevailing order is simply not an option for Christianity today. We are grateful for the massive contributions of monasticism of the past, and there is a need for monasticism today, but that cannot mean putting ourselves into a laager and trying to cut ourselves off from the outside world. We have been given a mission to go out into the world and to proclaim the kingdom. We cannot shrink back in fear and anxiety. We do not have a spirit of timidity, but we have the spirit of power, love, and self-control. And we are never to be ashamed of witnessing to Christ, as we hear in St. Paul's first letter to Timothy. Our foremothers and forefathers faced ridicule, rejection, and persecution for the sake of the gospel. How can we possibly think that we should withdraw into a shell and to isolate ourselves? We cannot accept the prevailing culture that suggests that religion must be privatized or simply be a personal affair. We have every right, indeed every duty, to practice our faith and to continue to strive for the renewal of the world and to make our voices heard for the common good and the advancement of human dignity. to place different spheres of life into silos that are absolute unto themselves and that are to be left in the hands of experts, such as political systems and the economy. Yet these are spheres of life that have had direct influence on the lives of people. And engagement are essential for those who strive for the coming of the kingdom. Fifthly, humanism. Finally, we are fellow workers with Christ in an endeavor to establish a new humanism. There have been monumental advances in the world over the past years in terms of health, education, technology, and science. All these have served humanity in the betterment of their lives. Similarly, there have been solid advances in the protection of human rights and the promotion of human dignity. Massive efforts have been made to eradicate poverty. Despite many flaws and imperfections, collaboration and cooperation between countries have resulted in institutions such as the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the European Union, the African Union. All these are imperfect, but nonetheless they are shining examples of what can be done when people work in unity rather than in opposition. Nonetheless, we seem to have entered